So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our conference. And without further ado, I would like to welcome here Professor Christian Lübke, very honored guest, who will be speaking about Christians and pagans, some reflections on their coexistence in medieval and Eastern Europe. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jerzy, for the invitation. And dear colleagues and friends, at the beginning, let me do some remarks in general. So when I received the invitation to participate in our conference and was asked to make a contribution, I, of course, had to think about a possible topic and take into account some prerequisites. The first Then have a good, yeah. No, sorry. Okay, second. The first prerequisite is my own experience in the research about pagan and particular Slavic religious beliefs, from which I have to confess that I'm not a proven specialist. Rather, I would see myself as an observer of religious manifestations on the outskirts of the general history of East Europe in the Middle Ages, which, however, and this is my second prerequisite, I started to study in a certain sense on the edge, namely on the northwestern edge of the Slavic world. That is with regard to the Polabian Slavs. But this is not a disadvantage if we account to the fact that, ironically, we can find the most substantial sources precisely there in the line of sight of the neighboring observers whose information found its way into the written sources. The third point is about terminology, starting again with these particular Polabian Slavs, which are often named Wends, particularly in some English language research texts. That corresponds with the vernacular usage in later medieval Germany and in some Scandinavian Old Norse texts, but in contemporary Germany, most researchers agreed not to use the term Wenden because of its diminutive sense. Furthermore, the name Wends suggests a general unity of all the various Slavic societies which lived in the areas along the Elbe and Saale rivers, extending somehow wider in the north and along the southern Baltic Sea coast. That is why the accurate but unfortunately a bit complicated term used in the German research literature is Elbe und Ostseeslawen, but that corresponds to Polish Połabczyzna and Połabianie, used explicitly in a wider sense because in the Middle Ages at times a particular small tribe existed under the name Polabians too. Another terminological problem is the usage of the term tribe itself. In German, Stamm, being discussed recently with a preference for the Latin term gens, or gentes, of course. And if we talk about the gentes and their beliefs, I have to say that I prefer another term compared to paganism, a term, however, that is not so much used in other languages than in German, namely Gentilreligion or Gentile religion. Rather, in English, one can find the term tribal religion. The decisive advantage of Gentilreligion or Gentile religion is the placement, so to speak, equivalent to other religions from the point of view of the religious studies, in the view of which Christianity is a universal religion, in German Universalreligion. The distinct difference between both is that the followers of a universal religion enforce the prevailing supremacy of their God everywhere in the world, whereas the followers of a Gentile religion believe in the dominance of their god or gods in the area inhabited by the particular gens, thus being valid particularly for the member of this gens. This also includes the fact that Gentile religious people recognize the existence and effectiveness of other deities, although not for themselves, but only for the members of the other gentes. In contrast, pagan, Latin paganus, is a term that in the view of the Christians denominates all the others whose Gentile deities are perceived as a threat to their own God. Finally, I would like to say a few words about the choice of my lecture topic, having observed the research on the religious development of medieval Europe, especially in the Barbaricum in the north and east of the continent in recent decades. One could see on the one hand the perception of the effective Christianization, which around the year 1000 ultimately brought about the existence of a uniformly Christian continent, with at most some Jewish sprinklings, and the apparently negligible but small troublesome regions at the Polabian Slavs and the Balts, while pre-Christian beliefs had virtually disappeared with quasi one wipe in favor of the newly created Christian states of the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, and the Rus. On the other hand, compared with that, there was an interest that was much smaller in pre-Christian, Slavic, and Old Norse Germanic religions, and some studies have been devoted to the topic of interpreting the accounts of Slavic religion written by Christian ecclesiastical authors in the style of an interpretatio Christiana. But apart from the expansion of ecclesiastical institution and of the general organization of the Christian church, and so to speak, in parallel, the commitment of the princely dynasties to the new religion, only few ideas have been developed about how the change of beliefs manifested itself in the majority of the people who were affected, and how the change influenced their lives. However, it is hardly conceivable that there was first a Gentile religion, followed then by Christianity, almost in one fell swoop. On the contrary, there must have been transitional phases, the appearance of which I would like to deal with in the following, at least to a certain extent. And this topic probably follows on quite well from the two previous lectures yesterday on syncretism phenomena. In the title of my paper, I use the term coexistence, that, however, might sound too optimistic in view of the undoubtedly existing and at times and in some areas even dominant hostile historical conditions. However, and I have to go further with the slides. This is already remembrance to this exhibition Europa's Mitte in year 1000 that was explicitly devoted to the Christianization of the continent and to the forming of the new princely states. And this is some pictures who illustrate these several and various phases of coexistence. And now I will go further with the historic development. Apart from the expansion of ecclesiastical institution and of the general organization of the Christian church, and, so to speak, in parallel, the commitment of the princely dynasties to the new religion, only few ideas have been developed about how the change of beliefs manifested itself in the majority of the people. So I've read that already. Please excuse that. It is not always, these are these phases, it is not always and everywhere a practice of living against each other. That means in opposition of enmity, but also of living side by side, that is more or less uninfluenced by each other or even together, that is in a certain exchange across spiritual boundaries and influencing each other. Syncretism, which can manifest itself visually in materiality and customs, is a sign of these latter relationships, which can also manifest themselves in the merging of beliefs or even in parallel practices, as it has been described under the term double faith, particularly for the phenomenon of Russian dvoyeverие. My initial question that I wanted to address here is the following. How could the Gentile religious and perhaps nominally converted Slavs live side by side, or intertwined in some cases with the Christians and under their rule? And this question also applies vice versa to the existence of Christians, whether they are members of the local elite or representatives of the Christian church in the midst of a predominantly Gentile religious environment. This situation could also concern merchants who however, were not interested to show their Christianity. I'm going to give a brief overview of the encounters between Christians and pagans in order to clarify the historical situations that are relevant to the key question. If I adhere to a certain chronological order, then this does not mean that individual forms of Christian-pagan encounters and relationships were bound to specific time periods. On the contrary, certain phenomena and patterns could occur throughout the entire time frame from the 6th to the 13th century. First of all, one might think of Samo, who lived among the Slavs in the 7th century as an originally Frankish merchant, and who, with their help, established an independent rule. From what we know of him, he probably had no interest in influencing his Slavic companions religiously in any way, and one must even doubt that he identified himself as a Christian in his everyday life. Next, one may recall the historic situation of the Slavic Carantanians or Alpine Slavs, against whom the Bavarians and Franks, with the help of the Bavarian Church, tested the strategic method of kidnapping members of the Slavic elite, educating and training them as Christians, and then sending them back as potential rulers. In the case of the Carantanians, this led 3 times to an uprising, which the sources refer to with a special term as Kamula, or in other words, the Carantanians were fighting against the presence and rule of a Christian prince among them. These events occurred in the middle and second half of the 8th century, when the missionary strategy of the Franks and the Christian church turned out to be pretty simple. They wanted to implement Christianity from above, on the initiative of converted, baptized, and politically dependent princes, into an area that was controlled from outside but must not yet have been fully integrated into their own sphere of power. This practice came into play, for example, with the baptism of the Saxon Widukind, a Teudon of the Avars, and the Danish king Harald Klak. It may also have been practiced, however, in a somewhat modified form towards the Moravians and the baptism of those 14 Bohemian duces who appeared with their men cum hominibus suis at King Louis' court in Regensburg also fits to this method of planned conversion. Next, one may look at rather naive questions that the Proto-Bulgarian Prince Boris asked the Pope in the middle of the 9th century concerning the consequences of a possible conversion. However, there were also regions under the control of the East Frankish Empire in which the encounter between Christians and pagans had a completely different character, as these were rather small groups of Slavs who had no ruling structures at all and who were integrated into the Frankish Empire's landlord system. I will discuss this zone of transit and integration stretching west of the Bavarian forest and of the rivers Saal and Elbe something later. Now I continue with some examples for the method of missionary attempts from above with the help of converted Slavic princes in this area, starting with Sklaumir, who was baptized in 821 but died before he returned into his Avatrid homeland. More than 100 years later, Tugumir, who had been educated in a Saxon monastery, returned to Brandenburg as the legitimate prince of the Hewelians, and thus helped King Otto I to gain the rule over the lands as far as the river Oder, a situation followed by the foundation of 2 bishoprics some years later and the Archbishopric of Magdeburg in 968. The lands assigned to these archdioceses, as well as the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, were those from which we have the most written records of the pre-Christian Slavic religion. If we recognize the first place or category of Christian-pagan encounters in the coexistence of Christians and Gentile religious people in the transition zones to the left of the Bavarian forests of Saale and Elbe, and the second category in the cases of the already Christianized Slavic princes who were sent back to their pagan homelands, then the northern Slavic areas of the archbishoprics of Magdeburg and Hamburg-Bremen represent a third category. In this last category, it was the situation of conquests carried out by the Saxons, subsequently followed by the intended conversion, that determined a largely confrontational, even hostile atmosphere. The situation existed since the military campaigns of King Henry I in the late 20s and early 30s of the 10th century, and lasted admittedly with some fluctuations and regional differences until the second half of the 12th century, when, with the so-called Wendish Crusade in 1147, the conquests of Albrecht the Bear and Henry the Lion, and finally the fall of the temple fortress of Arkona on the island of Rügen through the attack of the Danes in 1168, the Gentile religious beliefs were at least nominally extinguished. During this period, we can best discover a number of baptized princes among the abbotries. Finally, the combination of conquest and mission has a characteristic of this third category results in its regional expansion, namely through structurally parallel elements and processes in the area of the Baltic tribes in Prussia and Livonia, where some of the observations made in the area of the Polabian and Baltic Sea slaves were repeated with a certain time lag at the turn of the 12th to the 13th century, with the difference that there it was not a question of the direct integration into the land of the land's concerns into the Roman German Empire and its ecclesiastical organization. This is also related to the special role of the Teutonic Order and its striving for autonomy in the areas conquered by its knights. However, we owe this situation a somewhat deeper insight into the course of conquest and conversion, so that the relevant information in the written sources can also be used to interpret the conditions among the newly converted Polabian Slavs. This situation was somewhat different in other Slavic settlement areas, namely in Bohemia, Poland, and among the Eastern Slavs in the Kievan Rus, which is why we can speak of a fourth category here. The kingdom of the Moravians can also be regarded as a precursor of this type as early in the 9th century. In these cases, the victory of Christianity over the Gentile religion was also achieved from above, but not through pressure and intervention from outside, but from within the emerging and consolidating princely states, and the foundation of bishoprics and archbishoprics did not serve the integration into the one church of the Roman German Empire, but rather, in the contrary, the independent consolidation of the newly forming societies. However, it should also be taken into account that the aforementioned dynastic states did not emerge from a homogeneous social unit, that rather violence was also used to create them, and at least in the Kievan Rus and Hungary, there were ethnic differences between the elites and the mass of the population for some time. Anyway, with regard to the last two categories, the question arises as to whether the conversion to Christianity was faster and more successful with its own, albeit initially predominantly imported personnel, than the forced conversion from outside. In the second part of my lecture, I'm going to skip the second and fourth category due to the limited time, and instead enrich the first and third categories with a few examples. If you might remember, I started with the first category in the region of the Carantanians, whose lands were integrated into the Marcha Orientalis of the Frankish Empire, and which was the germ cell of the later Austria. The region was within the reach of the Archdiocese of Salzburg, whose white paper Conversio Bago Ariorum et Carantanorum presents the success of the Salzburg mission, but above all in terms of church politics and according to the collision of the missionary work conducted by the brothers Cyril and Method, Kirill and Methodius, and not in relation to what was happening with the Slavs in the countryside. But further in the north, we can see already Charlemagne himself had ordered the construction of 14 Slavic churches as a basis for the conversion of the so-called Main and Rednitzwens by the help of Bishop Bernwulf of Würzburg. As Charlemagne documented, the church's purpose was, I quote, that those people who have recently been converted to Christianity should have the opportunity to be baptized, hear the sermon, and attend the service. End of quotation. The existence of the Slavic population testify Slavic place names in this region until nowadays, and some of them are German Slavic mixed names, which allow to suggest linguistic exchange and co-working in the cultivation of land. A few years ago, a mission cross was found on the Rauer Kulm, that is a mountain that is striking due to its remarkable shape and at times served as the center of a Slavic settlement landscape. So the cross can be seen as small evidence of the implementation and success of the conversion. On the other hand, as canonical sources, namely some synodal resolutions in German Sendweistümer, testify the continued existence of Gentile religious practices were visibly, particularly here, more often than anywhere else in the areas conquered by Christianity. And when King Henry II pushed through the founding of the new Diocese of Bamberg in 1007, he justified this with the fact, I quote again, that the paganism of the Slavs should be destroyed there and that the memory of the Christian name could be celebrated there eternally then. End of quotation. In my opinion, King Henry acquires further significance in terms of Slavic religion, albeit long after his death. It is about the frequently quoted anecdote that is set in the 12th century and comes from the area of the Diocese of Bamberg, which documents the incomprehension of the Slav towards Christianity that is perceived as German, and at the same time the fundamental difference between traditional Slavic Gentile religion and the Christian universal religion is expressed in this story. The anecdote, which was first interpreted in this sense by Hans-Dietrich Karl in the 1960s and then used for future research, tells how a blind Slav receives advice from a Christian person to call on St. Henry II, the founder of the Bamberg diocese, for healing him from his blindness. Being completely amazed at this idea, the Slav then expresses his opinion that he could not expect any help from the Deus Teutonicus, because this God, in his perception, is only responsible for the Germans. The story fits to other information from this region. So already in 1059, Bishop Gunther of Bamberg had complained about the Slavs in his diocese, who, I quote, were devoted to the rites of the Gentiles and averse to the Christian religion. By the way, the term Deus Teutonicus also occurs in the life of St. Otto of Bamberg in reference to his mission in Pomerania. It remains difficult to place the Bamberg idols, which you can see on the right. It is difficult to place this in the context. The interpretation of these figures is still a mystery. However, a reference to cult figures from the steppe region seems more likely than the connection to the Slavic Gentile religion. Anyway, more than 2.5 or even 3.5 centuries after the construction of the 40 missionary churches, Germans and Slavs, or Christians and Gentile religious people, seemingly lived side by side, not necessarily against each other, but not with each other either. This situation can be considered a form of double belief as a characteristic religious phenomenon of a landscape that continued further northwards to the left of the Saale and Elbe rivers. One can only speculate about possible contacts between the Slavs there and those on the other eastern side of the rivers, both in terms of exchange in matters of faith and in questions of resistance against the Christian German supremacy. In any case, the situation was completely different at first, which the Würzburg Bishop Arn had to learn the hard way, falling victim to a fatal attack by Slavs in the year 892 during his return from a campaign against the Bohemians, which he had undertaken with Duke Popo, the warden of the Sorbian March. Around a century later, Bishop Dietmar of Merseburg recounts that this attack had taken place in an area named Hutici, in a region stretching from east of the Saale to the Mulde River. Not only Hutici, but the whole area east of Merseburg up to the river Oder and then reach to the region of the river Havel in the north had been military subjugated by Henry I, and a little later the socio-political elite of the Slavs there was eliminated by Margrave Gero. Through royal donations of land and villages to church institutions, which were intended to encourage missionary work and conversion, and to the secular elite from East Saxony and Thuringia, conditions were brought into line with those of the aforementioned Slavs in northern Bavaria and west of the Elbe and Saale. It was only much later, with the beginning of the edificatio terrae period, of the planned cultivation of land since the early 12th century, that a more effective administrative and ecclesiastical coverage of the region began, in which only then greater attention was paid to the elimination of Gentile religious practice in everyday life. The goal of edificatio terrae was linked with the conquest of land that were controlled by the Polabian Slavs in the north between the Havel region and the Baltic Sea. The marches implemented by the Ottonians here had been lost in the course of Lutean uprising since 983, and on the whole, with a few exceptions, had remained Gentile religious, or, as the Christian observers wrote, they fell victim to apostasy. Throughout the period up to the middle of the 12th century, when the conquest of the Christian neighbors began, there were always these cases mentioned at the beginning as the second category in which baptized Slavic princes exercised rule without questioning the existence of the Gentile religion in the lands around their princely seat, and therefore, quasi in return, they were also tolerated by the Gentile religious gentes, who enabled them, for example, to get closer to the Christian rulers with regard to their personal intentions. But I will leave out this entire complex, which would be the subject of a separate lecture, and just state that since the middle of the 12th century, with a statement by the chronicler Helmut of Bosau, within a short time, I quote, through the conversion of the Slavs, their entire country between the Baltic Sea and the Elbe to Schwerin was transformed by God's grace into settlement land of the Saxons. This statement concerned land that, according to my categorization above, belonged to the third category. After its conquest, a situation of coexistence of Christians and Gentile religious people arose here, parallel to the areas in northern Bavaria and east of Merseburg, but with the difference of the significant regular settlement of German-speaking farmers who were involved in the systematic cultivation of land. This pattern was also introduced in the lands conquered by the Teutonic Order in Prussia, and it is a source from this region, namely the Treaty of Christburg, that probably best describes the situation of the Gentile religious people after the conquest and the phase of challenge to the nominal existence of Christian structures. In the treaty concluded in 1249, the Prussians, who had since abandoned Christianity, were now obliged to abandon all pagan customs and ceremonies, including polygamy, the purchase of wives, the making of idols, and heathen burial rites. Christian duties, such as fasts, infant baptism, and annual confession and communion, had to be observed. 22 churches were to be built and maintained in places named in the treaty, with priests to be provided by the order. Some years ago, two Polish historians, Alicja Dobrosielska and Bogdan Radzicki, made a successful attempt, primarily on the basis of the Treaty of Christburg, to describe how the conquest and nominal conversion affected the lives and beliefs of the Prussians affected. I quote from the summary of their article: the cultural situation of the inhabitants of the Prussian territories at the time of its conquest is shown to have been extremely critical. The conflict placed the Prussians uneasily between the old and the new universe, subjecting them to a severe identity crisis. As Christians, they were cutting ties with their former gods. They could not observe the old cult, but at the same time had no fitting replacement for it. In the 13th century, churches as places of worship were scarce in the Prussian territories, as were cemeteries and priests in their role as religious experts. The situation was critical from the standpoint of the Prussians' religious needs. Christianization eliminated the traditional points of contact with the sacred, with next to nothing to offer in exchange. Having abandoned their old beliefs and broken links with the old gods, Prussian converts did not know where or how to address their prayers to the new god. In my opinion, the study is an excellent approach to the general problem of the coexistence of Christians and individuals recently forced into Christianity under pressure of the conquerors, and a very similar result produced Roman Azarov with reference to the Polabian Slavs in the year 2015, bringing together various information from the written sources. So I will close here. I had additionally one example for Dvojeverje. If there is some time later, maybe I will show the pictures because I have not in this version which I gave to it with the PowerPoint. But that would be interesting because that is illustration and the comparison of some old Russian icons with the figures you saw here, and especially with the figure from the Scrooge, and that would be interesting in the discussion maybe later. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating look on the religious dynamics. Are there any questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for this very nice overview. I have actually two questions regarding this. I think the second style of the Christianization. It means the baptized rulers or dukes, which were then sent back to this gentes. Why and how did accept it there? The people, yeah. It is if it was without the press, yeah. Why did were accept? And the second question, actually, it is regarding these priests, and so on. This new priest, new class. We know from this Great Moravian case that at the end there were many of the local people. It is according to legends. It is perhaps everything. It was not so extensive, perhaps, but in Moravia it looks like a very massive conversion and very effective teaching of this local people. How it could work.
Both questions are not so easy to answer. Related to the first one, that needs more research in these special cases, and that there is a particular situation in this Polabian Slav region, because the Abbot and others, the Hevelians, they had their princes, but the Lutetians and the so-called tribes or gentes further in the east and to the Baltic Sea, they were Asophalos. They were, let's say, democratic, and there was an elite, of course, that were the heads of the castles, but they did not have princes, and they were really fighting against, not only against Christianity, but against the princely power. And sometimes they have been infecting the abbotries, and there is discussion about that, if they also infected Poland, because, you know, there was this finding from Wrocław, a piece of wood which was interpreted in further times as a part of the the table or so, and then it was found out that it was anthropologic form like those in Großraden and so, and then was the interpretation that the lutetian kind of living infected the bones and had its part in the crisis of the Polish state after the death of Mieszko II. So that's a difficult situation. And the second about Moravia, that was a success, of course. But maybe all what we knew from the sources is concentrated on a rather small region of the whole Moravian Empire, and it is not the same situation in the further outskirts of the whole Moravian Empire.
Okay.
I would like to remember on the book of Henryk Wołomianski about the Slavic religion, and he saw in the process of Christianization 2 stages. At the first stage, there was only given the permission to the missionaries to make their work in the land, and then followed with the second stage. Then it was taken a decision, and now it is of course a decision to Christianize the whole land, but there were then the 2 possibilities that this was done through one person, let's say the master of the territory, but maybe even more, at least for me, the second is interesting. The second possibility, that the whole community decided to take Christianity because it was important to remain their juridical order, let's say, as a common order, not to split in 2 parts. Maybe the best example in Europe is in Scandinavia, but there were some such processes also on the Slavic territories. Yesterday had reminded Staszek Rosik in the situation in Szczecin, but I must now say that it was after the archaeological analysis the same situation also in Eastern Alps by Carantanians. Everything goes in this direction, that they took at the beginning of the 9th century together as a community the common decision that they take the Christianity as their religion. And then it seems that this is also the fundament, therefore, that their inthronization rights were preserved till the high Middle Ages. So only to stress this possibility.
I would try to answer very short, related to that study which I mentioned of the 2 Polish historians about the Prussians, because there the community accepted Christianity before, but then, as those 2 researchers found out, there was nothing. The priests didn't come to the villages. The churches were not built. The Teutonic Order had not enough personnel to replace the old gods and to replace the old forms of thinking with the new ones. So, and they say that was a kind of, they fell into nothing. And from that, they returned to their olds and made resistance against Christianity. So sometimes that may be a good form, that the community with a decision says, okay, we accept Christianity, but how goes it further? What after that? That's the question.
Maybe I'll ask one last question, if you allow. I really liked, and correct me if I got the wrong impression, that you redefined or the Dvojevěrje term, double belief, which is of course contested term and used for popular culture, that it could be used for certain situations of multi-ethnic or double ethnic coexistence, really. So I really like that. And do you think it could arise, this real confessional coexistence, only in this multi-ethnic environment, or could it happen also in one ethnic identity? You know,
that is the question. What I was thinking about when I prepared my lecture, because my imagination of Dvojevěrje, which I knew about that, was that it could be in one person who goes to the church on Sunday or so, but at the same time goes into the wood and has its old pagan or Gentile religion reads. Now, I think it could be both side by side for Christian persons at the one side, and the others maybe divided very visibly. But I must say, I did not speak very much about Dvojevěrje, but because that is, it has been called an invention of Russian historics, Russian Soviet historiography. I know from America, Stella Rock or so, she said that it is on the other side. There have been such phenomena, and maybe one of Western researchers should think it over, this problem from the beginning.
Thank you.
But
thank you.
Probably not me.
Okay, thank you very much once again.